Welcome to Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond podcast. I'm your host. My name is Franz. Welcome back to Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond. This is Franz. I wanted to continue the trip that I had when I brought my boat up from Indiantown, Florida, up to Hampton, Virginia. And I've already talked about the trip from Indiantown out to Cape Canaveral. And in the last episode, I talked about taking the boat from Cape Canaveral up to Charleston, where my wife got off and I had a couple new crew members join me. A couple things I don't think I talked about, a couple items that were of particular interest, was the stop in Savannah. I'd been to Savannah before by land, and it's one of those cities that you love to go visit again. And I had a couple choices on where to moor the boat. One was in the city marina, which is right next to the old cotton docks, right by the city, right in the tourist area of Savannah, or the other was across the river in a fairly new marina, and you'd have to take a ferry back and forth to get to Old Town. So I was thinking it was going to be difficult to get a spot at the town dock, which did have electricity, but not water. But the dock was entirely empty when I got there. There was a big sign where you would call a number and report that you're in, and give them all sorts of information and send them an email, and they would send you an invoice for the time you were there. I never got an invoice. I did everything that was required on the sign, but I never got any notice of any payment due. So basically, we were there probably about 3 nights altogether in Savannah, and we greatly enjoyed it. We restocked up food there and then continued on up the river or up the intercoastal waterway. But if you ever do get the chance to tie up at the town dock in Savannah, that was a big delight. And I was surprised that while we were there, no other cruisers came and used the town docks. We did have an incident that I don't think I mentioned. We went offshore from St. Augustine up past Jacksonville and came in near St. Mary's. We anchored in the Amelia River overnight and then continued north to Cumberland Island, and we spent a night in Cumberland Island, which is a national park, and took the dinghy ashore and wandered around there for a little while. But the next day we continued north, and the wind started coming up right on our nose, and the current was coming against us, and the waves and the wind were almost dangerous. We had to go through a narrow channel through the St. Andrews Sound. And like I said in the last episode, I'm not very excited about ever sailing the East Coast again because it is so shallow and you have to follow a narrow channel. This was particularly dangerous because we were motoring against the wind, barely making way, and I hadn't filled up fuel since before St. Augustine. Well, we were able to get through the Sound, barely able to get through the Sound with the wind and the current coming against us. We rounded the tip of Jekyll Island, and we finally found some shelter up maybe about a half a mile north of the tip of Jekyll Island. We were headed into Jekyll Island Marina, and the engine died. Now, I was suspicious that I was going to run out of fuel, and so I was ready. I dropped the anchor, but the anchor didn't grab, but it slowed us down, and it gave us a chance to refill the fuel from the 2 5-gallon jerry cans that I carry as spare. And also I changed the fuel filter, which was pitch black. It was dirty. I don't know what caused the engine to kill, either the oil filter or we ran out of gas, but I fixed both things. We filled fuel and I changed the oil filter. Then I had to bleed the engine, and then the engine started up again. Again, the wind is coming strong from the north. So we head up to the Jekyll Island Marina, and the marina is full, so we anchor near the marina for that night, and the next morning they find a spot for us at the dock, and we pull into Jekyll Island Marina, or Jekyll Harbor, I guess is what it's called. And we stayed there about 4 or 5 days. There was a big storm coming from offshore, and we were not going to go anywhere, so we rented a car and drove around quite a bit. I was able to get rid of my old outboard motor that had lasted me 30 years. It was a Mercury 2.5 outboard motor. I gave it to one of the dock boys, and I bought a new Suzuki outboard motor because my old outboard was just not reliable anymore. I needed to make sure I had a reliable outboard. So that was replaced in Jekyll Island. Jekyll Island is a delightful island, but what was even more interesting and more delightful was the island north of it, St. Simon's Island. We spent a lot of time driving around, enjoying ourselves, using the car and seeing the sights in the area. And then after the weather broke, we continued north. Well, now I've talked about this trip in the last episode, but I need to point out this. Initially, we used Navionics charts, which are now Garmin boating charts. And twice with my wife, using the charts, being in the channel, we ran aground. And our track shows us being right in the channel according to the charts. Fortunately, both times the tide was coming in, so we just had to stop and wait for the tide to lift us off. But after that, we switched to aqua maps, which were much better for doing the intercoastal waterway. In fact, I would have aqua maps on my iPad, and then I would have Garmin on my phone, and we would be using both of them going up the intercoastal waterway. But aqua maps for the intercoastal waterway were much better in my opinion. All right, so my wife and I get up to Charleston. We spend several days in Charleston. In Charleston, we anchored fairly near the baseball park in Charleston. So we had to go upriver and go under two bridges, and they both open at the same time. It's the Ashley, I think it's the Ashley Memorial Bridge. And then we anchored just on the north side of that bridge, past the marina, near the park. And there was a dinghy dock that we could take our boat to and leave it there and go to town. So that's what we did in Charleston until my wife needed to leave. And so we took the boat back to Safe Harbor Marina, one of the most expensive marinas I've ever been on, but a very nice marina, just back under the bridge. And we had a tie on the inside of the outside dock. And Safe Harbor's expensive, but they provide some amenities. They had a shuttle that would take you to town and back. They would take you to pick up groceries if you needed to. So we took advantage of that and enjoyed Charleston. Charleston is one of those towns that I had been to once before for a day, but I hadn't spent really any time in Charleston. And I would rate it above San Francisco. San Francisco used to be one of my favorite towns, but I think that town has deteriorated so much that it's not even on my bucket list to go to again. But Charleston I would go back to over and over and over again. Just a delightful town. Delightful town. Very much enjoyed walking around it. My wife flew out of Charleston, and then my next crew arrived. First of all, it's just Mike Epperson, who's sailed with me many times. He's my nephew, and he's been sailing with me many times. He's one of my normal, regular, favorite crew members to have on board. So it was just him and I for a few days until the next crew member arrived. I was going to have another friend join us, but his wife developed pancreatic cancer and he had to cancel. Well, we knew she had pancreatic cancer, but his life was really dictated by what the current tests were telling him, and he just felt that he couldn't come. So it was just Mike and I continuing up the intercoastal waterway, and the first day we leave, we go all the way across Charleston Harbor and enter the intercoastal waterway on the north side or the northeast side of Charleston Bay, head upriver, and just south of the Ben Sawyer Memorial Bridge, we run aground. One of many, many times I ran aground on the intercoastal waterway. Fortunately, it's mud, and you don't do any damage. But just north of that is a very, very shallow area you have to work your way through. And aqua charts, and I'm looking at aqua charts right now. It's a color-coded system on aqua charts. It goes from red to blue, red to yellow to light green to blue. So red is shallow, yellow is barely enough room for my boat, and it depends on the tide, of course. Charts are supposed to be low tide or mean low tide or spring low tide. I'm not sure exactly one, but if it's showing 7 feet on the chart and you're at high tide, you can add a few feet to that. This is a stretch where you had to watch your depth and watch your heading every second of the trip. We ran aground a couple times. One time we anchored at night in plenty of depth, and in the morning the tide had gone out so far that we were high and dry, and we had to wait for the tide to come in to get going again. So Mike and I continue to head up the Intercoastal Waterway, and now I'm looking at my schedule that I put together. So we went from Charleston to McClellanville, South Carolina, basically about 35 miles, then from McClellanville to Georgetown, South Carolina, another 20 miles. And Georgetown was a delightful town to visit. But to get into this town, you basically had to go on faith because the bottom was so soft I couldn't get a hard return on my depth sounder. So I didn't know how deep the water was, but it showed it on the chart as being very shallow. We were able to sneak in, anchor, perfectly calm water, a delightful town to visit. They've got a very historic waterfront, and that was actually one of the highlights with Mike. And then from Georgetown, from Georgetown, we headed north. We were going to stay at Osprey Marina, but I went by it and I didn't like what I saw, so we continued north. And this is where we anchored at Fantasy Harbor, just south of the bridge, and that's where we ran aground in the morning. Okay, so we went from there a long hop up to Holden Beach Transit Dock, which was a very inexpensive dock. We called ahead and made sure we had room. There's only room for about 2, maybe 3 boats on this dock. And it's right next to a park with showers, free laundry, a little park there. And we stayed there a couple nights. It was raining there one day, so it was a good stopover spot for the rain to come and go. The police station is right there by the park, and that's pretty much where you check in. And there are a couple nice restaurants very close to the dock. And that's where we spent the night, a couple nights, probably 2 nights, 3 days, maybe 3 nights. I don't really remember, but it was one of those places I'd go back again. According to No Foreign Lands, it says city-run transit dock, 90 feet long, reservations only, power, water, and a pump out available, showers and bathroom, floating dock, go to the town hall to check in, which is what we did. And that was actually one of the highlights of the trip, was this little town dock. And then we went for long walks along the beach, Holden Beach, which is a bunch of Airbnbs along the beach, it looked like. All right, from Holden Beach, the inexpensive city marina that we talked about, the city dock that we talked about, we went up to Southport Marina, and we tied up at Southport Marina, and I paid to have somebody scrape the bottom of my boat. The boat had been going very slow. Even though I had scraped it earlier, there were still a lot of barnacles. So I paid, and I had to pay about $300 to have him come out and scrape the bottom of the boat, which I thought was a little excessive. But after that, the boat moved along a lot faster. We were averaging maybe 4.5, 5 knots. We're now doing 5.5, 6 knots under power after that. And then from Southport, North Carolina, we headed up to Wrightsville Beach and anchored. And that's where we restocked food and picked up our other crew member, and that's Steve Reeder. Steve invited me to go sail on his boat. Steve is the man who bought Desperado, the Choi Lee 46 or 47, I forget exactly what it is, from my friend Jack Mahoney, who I used to sail out to the Channel Islands with. Before Jack passed away, he sold the boat to Steve. Steve wanted to have anybody that had sailed with Jack to come out and go sailing with him on Desperado again, so myself and Bud Elam went out and joined him, and I really like Steve, so I invited him to come out sailing with me, and he joined us in Wrightsville Beach and continued north the rest of the trip. Okay, so So this was the big event. When we left Wrightsville Beach, we had to get up early in the morning and go around and go through the bridge that opened up at a certain time. It only opened up once every hour, so we wanted to catch the early bridge opening in Wrightsville. And along the way, we ran aground again, trying to get around from Wrightsville to the bridge. We're able to get off of that and continued on to the bridge, got there just in time, barely, for the opening, and then continued north. And we're moving nicely, maybe about 5 miles north on the Intercoastal Waterway, very close to Camp Lejeune. And I was down below off watch. We were having watches of an hour on, 2 hours off. And I was down below, and suddenly the boat turns the wrong direction and ends up high and dry in the mud. Hard aground. We try everything. We tried kedging off. We tried tipping the boat back and forth. The tide is going out. The wind is blowing us farther onto the shallow. We try to take an anchor out and tip over the boat with the mast to turn it, to get the boat on the side where it's shallower. That didn't work. We tried for about 4 hours, everything I could think of, and we were just not having any luck. It was getting dark. High tide was not scheduled until around midnight. In the meantime, the wind was blowing us farther on to the shallow area, the flats, I would say. And before I left Indiantown, I went and bought an insurance policy from CITO. I was struggling whether I wanted to bother with it, but it was $250, and I thought, well, if I need it, it'll be worth it. And finally, after we tried everything we could do to refloat the boat, I finally called up CITO. And if you decide to do the Intercoastal Waterway, I'd suggest that you go ahead and get a contract with either Towboat, Boats US or CITO. They were out of Wrightsville. They were there within a half an hour, and he was able, with his big, powerful engines on his boat, to drag us off, and we were done. And he said, well, why didn't you call earlier? And I thought, I don't know why I didn't call earlier. That's why I paid for the insurance. And I should have just, when that happened and we couldn't easily get off, I should have just called him right away. He came out of Wrightsville. He was there very quickly. He said, I'm surprised you're down here because this is wide open. Usually he would have people that would go ashore north of where we were at. And so it was getting late in the evenings. We had lost an anchor and one of the lines that we were using to extend the anchor farther out. Somehow it came undone. And that was my main sheet. It's a long, long main sheet, and I didn't want to lose the main sheet. And also it was a fortress anchor on the end of that. So we spent the night in this harbor right at Camp Lejeune. We saw some soldiers coming out, standing in the parking lot, getting in some transport vehicles and driving off. They stood there for probably about an hour and a half, and then finally some transport vehicles came in and picked them up and hauled them away. We didn't go ashore, but the next morning we got up and went out to where we were stuck, and almost immediately we were able to recover my main sheet, and the anchor. So all was good. And then continued north to Beaufort, North Carolina, and we stayed at a marina at Beaufort for a couple days. The marina had a car we could borrow, so we went and borrowed the car one afternoon and went and saw some sights and did some shopping. And now I'd been to Beaufort, South Carolina, and Beaufort, North Carolina. They pronounce them differently, I'm not sure. We stayed at the Belhaven Marina, which is a very nice marina. Of the two Beauforts, I like Beaufort, South Carolina, quite a bit more than Beaufort, North Carolina. And then from there, we continued up to North River Bay in Barco, about 8 miles south of Coinjock. Now, we were looking at the weather, and there was a wide open area that was exposed to the north, and the winds were forecasting, well, let me back up. So we headed north from Belhaven, and initially we anchored at the northern end of the Alligator River just south of Albemarle Sound. So initially we're headed north. We planned to go to Coinjock Marina the next day. We anchored, and then I looked at the weather forecast, and the weather forecasts were for very strong winds from the north. And I knew we would have a hard time getting across Albemarle Sound, and it was late in the day, but I made the decision to pull up anchor and continue across Albemarle Sound when we had relatively flat water to avoid the big winds that were coming the next day. And that turned out to be a very smart thing to do. We did end up grabbing a crab pot. You pretty much couldn't avoid them. They were everywhere. We had to back up the boat to get it off the rudder, but we continued across Albemarle Sound. We basically had to go by GPS because we didn't have any light. It was getting late at night, and we pull into the North River, probably around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and drop anchor. And the next morning we continued up to Coinjock. And that was a really smart thing to do because the winds were just screaming out of the north. And it would have been very, very bad going across Albemarle Sound that day. And we did talk to boats that did it, and they were very, very beat up from going across Albemarle Sound that day. It would have been a time when I would have just said, we're waiting for better weather. And that weather continued on for several days. We ended up staying at Coinjock a couple nights. Coinjock's famous because it has a great steak restaurant, and we went to dinner there that night. My crew bought me dinner, which I really appreciated. And then from Coinjock, we basically head north to the Great Bridge Battlefield in Chesapeake, Virginia. We side-tied to the dock, and the next morning we sailed into Belle Isle Marina, where I left my boat in Hampton, Virginia. And on our way in, we ran aground another 3 or 4 times. That's just the life doing the Intercoastal Waterway. Plan on running aground a lot, learning how to get off, doing it over and over again. We put the boat in the marina. We rented a car and drove into Norfolk, did some odds and ends. Along the way, we had trouble with my windlass, so this is something I didn't talk about. My control switch, which puts the windlass up or down, quit working. It would work for putting the anchor down, but it would not work pulling it back up. So we played with it. I sprayed it with a bunch of contact cleaner. Eventually, I decided just to rewire the switch so that the roles were reversed, so it would pull the anchor up, and we could release the anchor with the clutch to let it down. Pulling up the anchor is the hard part, not putting it down. So in Norfolk, Virginia, we found a replacement switch at a Granger, so we went and picked that up, did a few other odds and ends, and then put the boat away, and the crew departed. That pretty much summarizes my full summer sail this year. I will be going back probably in August or September to go sailing on the Chesapeake. I've heard good things about the Chesapeake. Maybe that will change my mind about sailing on the East Coast. I hear good things about the Chesapeake. But from the trip from Cape Canaveral north, it was a long, long slog. A lot of miles. It was daily get up, motor, go to bed, get up, motor, go to bed, run aground, get off. There were some nice towns along the way when we anchored and walked around, but it's not something I would really want to do again. All right. A long, drawn-out, sort of boring trip report. One last thing I wanted to point out. I retired this year, and I have lots of time on my hands, and I've started another podcast. I'm not sure if you would be interested in it or not, but I'd love to have you go listen to it and give me your thoughts. It's called Markets Without Spin, Follow the Incentives. And this has nothing to do with sailing. It is about incentives and how they affect corporate management decisions. I've released 5 episodes so far. I would love it if you'd go into whatever podcast app you use and subscribe to it. It's called Markets Without Spin, and it's got my name, Franz Amison, on it. And I'll be releasing episodes probably about once a week in that podcast, talking about incentives, corporate behavior, because that's the business I worked in. I worked in finance since 1985 until January 1st this year. And I want to talk about my observations on corporate incentives and various incentives that drive behavior. I'm slowly backing away from sailing in the Mediterranean and beyond. And if you have some thoughts or ideas on what to do with this podcast, let me know. As you know, I'm not releasing many episodes because, quite honestly, it's just getting old. I've been doing it since 2013. And I have 294 episodes out there. I'm sort of running out of material to talk about. I could probably go back and talk about the same stories over and over again. And unless you've listened to the full library, it would be new to you. But for me, it's just treading on the same path over and over and over again. But don't forget, there's 294 episodes of Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond going back to 2013. And if you can't find them in your podcast app, go to the website, medsailor.com, and you can find them all at the website, medsailor.com. All right. Love it if you do that for me. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts, email me, franz1@medsailor.com. Don't forget, my boat is for sale. I'm 73 years old now, and it's getting harder and harder for me to maintain the boat. It's in great shape. I have a broker. If you're interested in looking at the boat, give me a call or write me an email, and I will call you and talk about it and give you the contact information for the broker. But I'm not going to quit sailing. I'm setting up a sailing group at my club, the Alta Club in Salt Lake, and we're going to go over, and I plan on going back and chartering a boat in Greece probably next summer. And I have specific places I want to go. I spent so many years sailing Greece and Turkey, and I know it very, very well. And I know places that most people would never know to get to. So I'm going to share that with some friends, probably next summer. And I look forward to your comments. Get out there and go sailing. Thanks a lot. If you find any of this content valuable and you would like to support the podcast, the easiest way to do it is to go to the website, medsailor.com, and buy some of the audio lessons I've prepared for learning to sail. I have lessons for the ASA 101, the 103, and the 104. Also, if you'd like to become a Patreon, I'd appreciate it. Just click the link on the website. The website for Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond is www.medsailor.com. Again, medsailor.com. Life is short. In the end, all that really matters is the memories you make. So make a few. Go sailing.
Joel, you want to know something? What? Every now and then, say what the gives you freedom. Freedom brings opportunity. Opportunity makes your future. If you can't say it, you can't do it.